The invitation arrived on a bitterly cold evening, slipped through the narrow gap beneath my front door. I almost didn't notice it at first, just a plain, unassuming envelope lying amidst the cluttered remains of my mail. But when I picked it up, I felt it immediately. The weight of it was wrong, too light for something so ominous. I shouldn't have opened it. The paper inside was thin, almost translucent, as though hurriedly torn from an old notebook. The handwriting was uneven, its ink slightly smudged, as though scrawled in desperation. Join us where the last light fell, on the edge of Hollow Ridge, 11:59 p.m. A reckoning awaits those who ignored their echoes. I stared at the words for what felt like an eternity. Hollow Ridge. I hadn't heard those words in a year, not since the night I'd vowed never to return. The memories of that place were buried deep, locked away in the darkest corners of my mind. And yet, the letter pulled them to the surface like a hook in a festering wound. I should have burned it, but I didn't. Instead, I found myself gripping the envelope with trembling hands, unable to shake the gnawing sense that this was meant for me. The phrase, "last light fell," rang with an eerie familiarity. It could only mean one thing: the night of the accident. A storm of questions tore through my mind. Who sent this? What did they know? Was this some cruel prank? Deep down, I already knew the answer. No one else could have written this. By the time I realized I was already moving, it was too late. I grabbed my coat, car keys, and flashlight, unable to resist the pull of that cursed place. As I drove, the world outside my windshield became a murky blur. The fog rolled in thick and heavy, swallowing the road ahead. My headlights barely pierced the shroud, illuminating little more than the skeletal branches of trees that stretched overhead like crooked fingers. When I reached Hollow Ridge, I killed the engine and sat in silence, staring at the dark expanse ahead. The ridge loomed against the starless sky, its edges jagged and uneven. The only light came from a single lantern flickering faintly in the distance. My breath fogged up the windshield as I stared at it, transfixed. The air outside was deathly cold, the kind of cold that bites through layers and settles in your bones. I zipped my coat tighter and stepped forward, every crunch of frost beneath my boots louder than it should have been. As I approached the lantern, unease crept over me like a second skin. It wasn't just the eerie stillness of the night or the oppressive quiet that made me feel that way. It was the sensation that I was being watched. The darkness around me seemed alive, shifting at the edges of my vision. I kept turning, expecting to see something or someone, but there was nothing. When I reached the lantern, my unease turned to dread. Beneath its weak light, a woman stood. She was facing away, her figure obscured by a thick coat and hair that hung limp like wet strands of rope. "Hello," I called, my voice breaking the silence. She didn't move. I took a hesitant step closer. I got this letter. Was it from you?" Her head tilted slightly, just enough for me to see a sliver of her profile. Her skin was pale, almost translucent, and her lips were pressed into a thin, unmoving line. She didn't speak, but her presence seemed to answer the question. "You shouldn't be here," she said finally, her voice low and brittle, like the sound of dried leaves crushed underfoot. A chill crawled down my spine. "What do you mean? Who are you?" She turned fully then, her face illuminated by the lantern's flickering glow. My breath caught in my throat. There was something off about her. Her features were wrong, mismatched in subtle ways that made her seem both human and something entirely other. "You don't remember, do you?" she asked, stepping closer. Her words struck me like a physical blow. Memories I had fought to suppress surged back. The laughter of friends, the crackle of a campfire, and then screams. A screech of tires, glass shattering, a plunging darkness that seemed endless. "I don't know what you're talking about," I lied. my voice barely audible. Her lips twisted into a cruel smile. Lying won't save you. They've been waiting. You ignored them, left them behind, and now they want what's owed. Before I could respond, the whispers began. At first, they were faint, like the rustling of leaves in the distance. But as they grew louder, they filled the air around me, overlapping voices that spoke in broken phrases and accusing tones. You left us. Why didn't you save us? You knew. I spun around, searching for the source, but the whispers came from everywhere and nowhere all at once. Shadows stretched and twisted along the ground, rising like smoke. They took on shapes, indistinct figures with hollow eyes that seemed to bore into my soul. No, I whispered, stumbling back. This isn't real. But it was. I could feel the cold weight of their presence pressing down on me, suffocating and inescapable. They're here for you, the woman said, her voice cutting through the whispers like a blade. You can't outrun your echoes. As she spoke, the shadows began to move, closing the distance between us. Their forms grew more defined, and I recognized them. Faces I hadn't seen in a year. Faces I thought I'd never see again. I backed away, the ground beneath me soft and unstable. I was trapped, teetering on the edge of the ridge, with nowhere to run. And the whispers grew louder. The ridge felt alive beneath me, the ground shifting subtly as if rejecting my presence. The whispers swelled, an overwhelming cacophony that blurred into a single, haunting truth. I couldn't escape. The shadowy figures encircled me, their movements slow and deliberate. Their hollow eyes glowed faintly, flickering like dying embers. I wanted to run, but my legs refused to move. The cold of their presence seeped into my skin, freezing me in place. The woman stood at the center of it all, her expression unreadable. Do you understand now? She asked, her voice calm but laced with an edge of cruelty. I don't know what you want from me, I shouted, though I could barely hear my own voice over the whispers. She stepped closer, her movements deliberate, the lantern's light casting long, jagged shadows across her face. They want what was taken from them, what you took. I shook my head, panic bubbling in my chest. I didn't take anything. I didn't. You did. Her voice cut through my denial like a blade. You chose yourself. You left them behind to save yourself. The memories crashed over me like a tidal wave. That night a year ago, the laughter, the fire, the crash. I remembered the split-second decision to save myself, to climb out of the wreckage and run before the flames consumed everything. I remembered the cries for help, fading into silence as I fled. I didn't have a choice, I whispered, the words hollow even to my own ears. Her gaze hardened, and the figures drew closer, their shapes more defined now. I recognized them all. Sarah, with her bright smile that had once lit up a room. Mark, always cracking jokes no matter the situation. And the others, faces I hadn't allowed myself to remember until now. They waited for you, the woman said, but you left them in the dark, and now they've come to take you back. The shadows surged forward, their hands reaching out. I stumbled backward, my foot slipping on the loose gravel at the edge of the ridge. My heart raced as I teetered dangerously close to the precipice. No, I screamed. I didn't mean for this to happen. Intent doesn't matter, the woman said, her voice cold and final. Only balance does. I fell to my knees, clutching the frozen earth beneath me as the figures loomed above. Their forms were warped, their once familiar faces twisted by anguish and anger. They didn't speak anymore. They didn't need to. Their presence alone was an accusation, a judgment. What do you want me to do? I asked, my voice trembling. How do I fix this? The woman knelt before me, her face inches from mine. Her breath was cold, her eyes void of any humanity. Balance must be restored. A life for a life. Blood for blood. My stomach churned as her words sank in. You want me to die? No, she said. We want you to choose. She placed a dagger in my hand, its blade gleaming unnaturally in the dim light. The metal felt cold, almost alive, pulsing faintly as if it had a heartbeat of its own. Carve the sigil, she instructed, pointing to the ground. Speak the words I give you and offer what you denied them, a chance to move on. I stared at the blade, my hand trembling. And if I don't? The figures closed in, their hollow eyes fixed on me. The whispers returned, louder and more frantic, a chorus of anguish and fury. The woman's lips curled into a cruel smile. Then they will take what is owed, and you will never leave this ridge. My pulse thundered in my ears as I realized I had no choice. Taking a deep breath, I plunged the dagger into the frozen ground, carving the sigil she described. The blade moved as if guided by some unseen force, etching symbols I couldn't comprehend, but instinctively knew were ancient and powerful. As I worked, the whispers began to change, shifting into a low hum that reverberated through the air. The figures grew still, their forms flickering like shadows cast by a dying flame. Speak the words, the woman commanded. I hesitated, the syllables foreign and jagged on my tongue. But as I began to chant, the air around me grew heavier, thick with an unnatural energy. My voice echoed back at me, distorted and layered, as though the ridge itself was speaking the words alongside me. When the last syllable left my lips, the ground beneath me shook violently. The sigil glowed with an eerie, pale light, illuminating the figures in sharp relief. Their faces softened, their expressions shifting from anger to sorrow. One by one, they began to dissolve, their forms breaking apart like ash caught in the wind. Sarah was the last to go. She lingered for a moment, her gaze meeting mine. Her lips moved, forming a single silent word. Why? Before I could answer, she was gone, leaving only the woman and the lantern's flickering glow. It is done, she said, rising to her feet. But remember this. Balance is not permanent. The echoes will return if you forget again. Her form began to flicker, dissolving into the night like the others. The lantern extinguished itself, plunging the ridge into darkness. When I opened my eyes, it was dawn. The ridge was eerily silent, the sigil gone as if it had never been. But my hand bore the mark of the blade, a faint scar in the shape of the symbols I had carved. As I walked back to my car, the whispers followed me. The drive home was silent. Not the peaceful kind of silence, but the suffocating stillness that sits heavy in the chest, pressing down like a weight you can't shake. My hands gripped the wheel tightly, my knuckles pale under the dim light of the rising sun. I kept glancing at the faint scar on my palm, the sigil etched into my skin like a brand. It pulsed faintly, the sensation not quite painful, but a constant reminder that the night's horrors had been real. The whispers hadn't stopped. They were quieter now, faint murmurs that slithered just at the edge of hearing. I turned the radio on to drown them out, but it only made them worse. They rose and fell, harmonizing with the static, as though the very air around me was alive with their presence. When I finally reached home, I locked the door behind me, the deadbolt sliding into place with a satisfying click. It offered little comfort. My house felt wrong, too cold, too dark. Shadows lingered in corners where no light should have reached. I told myself it was just my imagination, the residue of fear clinging to my mind like cobwebs. But I knew better. I avoided the mirrors. I couldn't explain why, but something about my reflection felt dangerous, as though I might see something there that wasn't supposed to exist. Instead, I sat at the kitchen table, the scar on my palm catching the light as I turned my hand over and over again. It's over, I whispered, trying to convince myself. It's done." The words sounded hollow. The mark began to itch. I rubbed at it absently, but the sensation only grew worse, spreading like fire up my arm. The whispers grew louder, coalescing into a single voice. Her voice. "Did you think it would be that easy?" My head snapped up. The kitchen was empty, but the air felt charged, heavy with an oppressive energy. The mark on my palm burned now, the sigil glowing faintly in the dim light. "No," I whispered, shaking my head. "I did what you asked. I balanced it. Her laughter cut me off, low and mocking. It seemed to come from everywhere at once, reverberating through the walls, the floor, even the very air I breathed. "You think balance is so simple, that one act can undo a lifetime of choices?" The shadows in the room began to move, pooling together like ink spilling across the floor. They rose, taking shape, their forms familiar and wrong all at once. It was them, Sarah, Mark, and the others. Their faces were clearer now, their eyes empty and accusatory. "You don't get to walk away," Sarah said, her voice as cold as the grave. I stumbled back, knocking over the chair. "No, I did what she asked. You're free." "Free." Mark's voice was a low growl, filled with bitterness. "You can't free us from what you've done." They moved closer, their forms flickering like an old film reel, disjointed and unnatural. The mark on my hand flared with pain, the light from the sigil casting their faces in sharp relief. I backed into the wall, the cold seeping into my spine as they loomed over me. "What do you want from me?" I screamed, my voice breaking. Sarah knelt in front of me, her empty gaze locking with mine. "We want you to understand, to feel what we felt, to carry the echoes with you, forever." The mark burned brighter, the pain unbearable. The whispers erupted into a deafening roar, filling my head until I thought it might split open. I closed my eyes, clutching at my hand as the world around me seemed to collapse. When I opened them, they were gone. The room was quiet again, the shadows still. But the mark on my hand remained, pulsing faintly with a life of its own. The whispers had faded, but I could still hear them, buried deep within the silence. I knew they weren't truly gone. The echoes of that night, of my choices, would follow me for the rest of my life. I would carry their voices, their pain, their judgment, and one day they would return. I sat in the dark, staring at my hand, and waited for the sun to rise. But deep down, I knew the light would never truly reach me again.